Well, good morning, everyone. It is great to see you. Thank you for coming together. Thank you for inviting me to have a chance to visit with you briefly. I apologize for running late. We're in the middle of votes on the Senate floor, so I just ran from one vote, and in a few minutes I'm going to have to turn around and run the vote again, but we'll have a chance to visit briefly. Now, this is an impressive gathering of young people devoted to change, devoted to making a difference in our communities, devoted to making a difference in our country. I think that's fantastic. There's also a group of considerable erudition. And one of the things people look at sometimes is etymology, is the roots of words that are used. If you look at the word politics, it has two parts in the original Greek. Poly, meaning many, and ticks, meaning blood-sucking parasites. Which is a fairly accurate description of Washington, D.C. So, welcome to the Capitol. It is great to see you. What I want to do very briefly is talk about two things and then just open it up to questions. We'll have a few minutes just to talk about any issues that are weighing on your hearts and minds. The first thing I want to talk about is, as was just referenced, what we were doing this morning. So at 10 a.m. this morning, I was part of a press conference with Senator Kirsten Gillibrand. And I think about 8 senators altogether. It was a bipartisan group. You had Barbara Boxer, you had Rand Paul, you had Dick Blumenthal, and you had Chuck Grassley. I mean, it was a varied group. And what we were standing together, working together, something that I've been working very closely with Senator Gillibrand on. And that is her legislation concerning sexual assault in the military. And it's an interesting example. You will rarely see groups as bipartisan and diverse as the groups that were assembled this morning. And the issue is kind of interesting. When we had a whole series of hearings in the Senate Armed Services Committee a year and a half ago on the problem of sexual assault. And I went into those hearings very much on the fence on the legislation. There were people with strong arguments that it would damage good order and discipline in the military. I heard those arguments. There were people with strong arguments that said we had to do more to protect men and women in the military from sexual assault. So I went into the hearing very much with an open mind, undecided, and I listened to the arguments back and forth. And at the hearing, I cast a vote in favor of Senator Gillibrand's legislation, became a co-sponsor, and for now, north of a year, she and I have been fighting together on this issue. And one of the things I said at that hearing was that I listened to the arguments, and 2 arguments in particular Senator Gillibrand had raised resonated and convinced me. Number one, she made the point that sexual assault in the military, the rates of assault, have been unacceptably high for decades. And that the leadership keeps pledging to do everything possible to stop it, and what they're doing isn't working. It isn't working, and the number one reason victims of assault give for not coming forward and reporting is that they do not trust the chain of command. They don't trust their boss to make a fair decision about whether to prosecute an assaulter who may well be buddies with the commanding officer. The second argument she made was that a number of our allies, like Canada, like the UK, like Israel, had implemented similar reforms to have the decisions on whether to charge someone with sexual assault made not by the commanding officer, but made by a professional military prosecutor. And that they saw no diminution in good order and discipline when they implemented those. I'm someone that's driven by data and evidence and what works. We ought to be fixing the problems we have in this country. And I said those arguments persuaded me. I voted in favor of it. And it was very funny. When I walked out of the hearing, a reporter from New York ran up to me and said, "Were you telling the truth when you said that you hadn't made up your mind and the arguments at the hearing convinced you?" And I laughed and said, "Well, yeah." And he said, "I'm amazed. I thought all of these hearings were for show. I didn't think anyone was ever convinced of anything in a hearing." And he ended up writing a column that week that said, "Hell froze over and pigs flew this week. And a Senate hearing actually changed the mind of a senator." Now, I use that as an example. We had a vote several months ago where 55 senators voted in favor of changing it. We needed 60. Because the issue was filibuster, but 55 was the most senators who have ever done that. I think we're making real progress moving that issue forward. I'm hopeful that we'll continue to make progress. Now, second thing I want to say very briefly is that y'all are engaged in philanthropy, you're engaged in civic engagement, because you recognize there are huge challenges, and there are challenges facing young people. There are challenges facing the future that the only people who are going to fix it is us. There's nobody else who's going to step forward and address these challenges. And in my view, we ought to have bipartisan agreement on a lot of the great challenges facing this country. I'll tell you, my top priorities in office are threefold. Number one, bringing back jobs and growth and opportunity. I think that should be a bipartisan objective. You should see everyone coming together saying, we have got to get out of the anemic growth that we've been trapped in for the last 6 years. We've got to get back to an economy that is booming, that is growing, that has small businesses prospering, because when you have growth, it lifts people up the economic ladder and enables people to achieve the American dream. The two most effective levers for growth comes from the private sector, but the two most effective levers government can provide are tax reform and regulatory reform. Historically, every time we pursued those levers, the result has been incredible growth, which helps people achieve opportunity. And it's my hope, we're going to have a new Senate come January, it's my hope that we see serious leadership coming together and passing positive pro-growth economic legislation to get the economy moving. The second critical area of priority is defending our constitutional rights. And in my view, the Bill of Rights shouldn't be a partisan issue. We should all come together and say, let's defend and vindicate the constitutional liberties that built this country. And number three is restoring America's leadership. We're facing extraordinary challenges abroad. Just 2 weeks ago, I participated in a bipartisan trip to a defense conference up in Halifax, Canada. There are about 60 countries from all over the world, close allies of America that were up there, defense ministers, foreign ministers, and we met over and over again with leaders of other countries who, they would pull you aside, they'd grab you, and they'd just say, where is America? I mean, these are our friends and allies begging us. When America doesn't lead, it makes the world a much more dangerous place. And I do hope and believe with the new Senate, you're going to see far more vigorous attention on the need for American leadership abroad to stand with our allies and to stand against serious national security threats facing this country. All of those, I hope, are issues that can bring together bipartisan cooperation. All of those, I hope and believe, are issues that also can energize young people. Because at the end of the day, it is the young people that are going to face these problems going forward, and it is time, frankly, for our generation to step forward more and more and lead, and I'm encouraged because I think that's happening, and y'all are terrific evidence of that. And with that, I'm happy to answer or dodge any question you like. Yes?
We have a legislation that Congresswoman Cruz and Congressman Tom Marino had offered about sex trafficking that was voted unanimously in Congress, and we'd like to take the lead and get the Senate to sign it. The President has already agreed to signing. So it's truly up to the Senate, and it would be a wonderful thing to start the year with a bipartisan effort on behalf of those victims of sex trafficking, and especially because juvenile prostitutes are trafficked, they're victims, they're not criminals. So to eliminate them from being looked upon as criminals is a huge step forward. So I'm handing it to you to make sure that it's signed by the Senate unanimously on behalf of all of us. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for your leadership on the issue. I mean, sex trafficking is an issue that is horrific. I mean, it is human slavery in our time. And there needs to be far more vigorous leadership on that issue. I'm happy to look at the particular legislation that you raised, and it is, I mean, I can tell you I've spent a lot of years of my adult life in law enforcement. And in particular, going after sexual predators and murderers and those who target the young. And sadly, there is a face of darkness in the world that we need to be vigorous, standing up and fighting. And so I commend you for your leadership and look forward to working together. Wonderful. Yes, sir.
Good morning, Senator. My name is Adam Seif, and I recently graduated from Stanford Law School. A project that we did at the law school is we had people come together and do a model of budget simulation. We came up with a bipartisan solution. I was wondering, in your experience, what's one thing that Democrats can concede on in coming together to pass a budget for attaining economic growth? And what's one thing that Republicans can concede on in coming together and passing a budget and attaining economic growth?
You know, it's a very good question. The short answer is if you look to the last 2 years, I don't know. We unfortunately have seen for 2 years a Senate that has been locked in partisan gridlock. And the majority leader, Harry Reid, blocked votes on virtually everything. I hope and believe we'll see a different majority come January, and a majority that behaves differently. And in particular, one of the interesting, so look, on the question of tax reform, in the last 2 years we've had no bipartisan legislation on tax reform because under Majority Leader Reid, Democrats were blocked from doing anything for Republicans. The same was true on regulatory reform. We didn't debate it, we didn't vote on it, there were no votes on the floor. One of the commitments Mitch McConnell, the new majority leader, has made is opening up the Senate again to debate and to amendments. You know, it's interesting. You'll apologize, man. I see actually LBJ's book or the book on LBJ, Caro's book on the path to power. By the way, if you haven't read the Caro books, they're fantastic. Students of the Senate will observe that the two historical powers of a senator are the ability to debate and the ability to amend. And that's the way the Senate has operated for centuries. The last couple of years, what we've seen is Majority Leader Reid has used a parliamentary procedure called filling the tree to block all amendments. And so what happens is, Majority Leader only has one power under the Senate rules, and that's the priority of recognition. The majority, if 2 or more senators stand up on the floor, the Majority Leader will always be recognized first. That's the only power and rule of the Majority Leader. But what Reid has done for the last couple of years is he'll get up, he'll bring a bill to the floor. He will then offer an amendment, and it's typically a meaningless amendment. Change September 30th to October 1st. So that amendment is pending. He will then offer an amendment to the amendment. Change October 1st to October 2nd. Now, neither of those amendments are intended to pass. They're simply intended under parliamentary rules if there's an amendment pending, an amendment to that amendment pending. No other amendments are in order. As a consequence, every bill that has come, not every bill, but every major bill, every bill of significance that has come up has had no amendments from any senator, Republican or Democrat. And that has effectively shut the Senate down. One of the things McConnell has pledged, he's not going to do that, he's going to open up amendments, which means, I'll tell you, there are a number of Democrats who privately say they're willing to work together on tax reform, on regulatory reform, but as long as there were no amendments, there was no room to work. I'm hopeful with the Republican majority. Listen, to get anything passed in this new Senate is going to take 6 Democrats. We're likely going to have 54 Republicans. The Democrats can filibuster anything, which means they can demand 60, which means you're going to have to get 6 Democrats. It is my hope that we see that. I'll give you an example, corporate tax reform. We have the highest corporate tax rates in the developed world. Makes no sense. Roughly $2 trillion in capital is overseas because U.S. corporations aren't bringing it back, aren't creating jobs because they don't want to be subject to punitive double taxation. This ought to be a no-brainer to bring capital back to create jobs. Now, it's something, frankly, the President has spoken favorably about, but I can tell you in the last 2 years, we've had 2 chairmen of the finance committees, Max Baucus, a Democrat, and Ron Wyden, another Democrat, both of whom wanted to do tax reform, and Harry Reid blocked them, said, no, the Finance Committee's not doing tax reform. So I'm hopeful without that blocking, we will see people coming together. I'd like to see people coming together on corporate tax reform, on individual tax reform, on simplifying the tax code. You know, it's one of the great examples of essentially free money in Washington. If you look at The last time we had fundamental tax reform was 81 and 86 when Reagan was president. That was done on a bipartisan basis. It was done when Tip O'Neill was Speaker of the House. I'm hopeful we can see that again, but I don't have specifics right now because for the last 2 years, the institution's been shut down. I believe our new majority leader, when he says he's going to change that, and I think that's going to set up the opportunity for more bipartisan compromise. I certainly hope it is.
Here's the legislation.
Fabulous. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Senator Cruz. I'm a junior at Garland, but I hail from Allen, Texas.
Excellent.
So my question is, given the unchecked growth of healthcare spending over the last few decades, and what can you expect the Republican majority in Congress to do, in the Senate right now, to do over the next 2 years specifically to secure our healthcare entitlements?
Well, it's a great question, and there's a lot of different substance to it. So when you say healthcare entitlements, you can have a whole discussion about Medicare and Medicaid, and I think we've got to have fundamental entitlement reform to preserve those programs. They're basic bulwarks of our society that people have grown to rely on, and right now, I think it's irresponsible. They're careening towards insolvency. It's irresponsible to continue with that. I'm not optimistic Congress will do much on entitlement reform in the next 2 years because, unfortunately, the position of the White House has been, you take the last budget deal we had. The White House informed the Senate they were unwilling to even talk about entitlement reform. So unless there's a significant change, I don't anticipate that in the next 2 years. When it comes to, let's set aside those entitlements, let's focus on Obamacare. Now, I recognize my position on Obamacare has been quite ambiguous. Listen, Obamacare is a disaster substantively. 5 years ago when it was being debated, I think reasonable minds could have differed. Today, seeing the effects that it has caused millions of Americans to lose their jobs, to be forced into part-time work, to lose their health insurance, to lose their doctors, to see their premiums skyrocket. I think at this point it is the essence of pragmatism and reasonableness to acknowledge this thing isn't working, we need to repeal it and start over. Now your question is, what can we do to fix it after we repeal Obamacare? And let's address some of the chuckling there. Please. I'm always happy to have a conversation. Listen, the new Republican majority, I think we should bring up and pass legislation repealing Obamacare in its entirety. The president will almost assuredly veto it. Once that happens, we should start systematically addressing some of the most egregious aspects of Obamacare and vote on them one at a time. So, for example, the president said 28 times, looking at the TV camera, if you like your health insurance plan, you can keep your health insurance plan. We now know that statement is false. In fact, PolitiFact called it the lie of the year. About 6 million Americans have had their health insurance canceled because of Obamacare, and millions more are coming. We have to start with legislation that puts into law what the president said over and over again, that no one's insurance plan will be canceled because of Obamacare. That was a promise the American people were told. We ought to vote on that. Now, I don't know if we can get 6 Democrats on that or not. I know a lot of Democrats campaign saying they don't like that aspect of Obamacare. In fact, they're turning off my mic as I say it. Yet another aspect we ought to focus on is changing the definition of full-time work. One of the most horrific consequences. Let me tell you a story. 6, 7 months ago, I was in Nebraska. I was at a rally in North Platte, Nebraska, out in the countryside. We had nearly 1,000 people came out to this rally, out in the middle of the countryside. A young woman came up to me and she hugged me. And she said, "Ted, I'm a single mom. I've got 6 kids at home. My husband left me and he won't pay child support." She said, "Right now I'm working 5 different jobs. And not a single one of them is 30 hours a week because Obamacare kicks in at 30 hours a week." She started to choke up. She said, "Listen, I'm struggling to make enough money to keep clothes on the backs of my kids." And she said, "The hardest part, I never get to see my kids. I go from job to job to job, and they don't get the mom that they need and deserve." So another example of a focused Repeal is changing the definition from 30 hours to 40 hours. Susan Collins, a moderate Republican from Maine, introduced that legislation. I think that's a great example. We ought to do one after the other after the other. But I'm also convinced in 2017, I think these elections in 2014 were front and center a referendum on Obamacare. And I think the 2016 presidential election is going to be as well. And I believe come 2017, a Republican president is going to sign legislation repealing this. Let me make two more points on this. Number one, for young people. You know one of the simplest ways to understand Obamacare? It is a massive wealth transfer from young, healthy people to everybody else. You know, Jonathan Gruber, the professor at MIT, just made national news by pointing out that they passed Obamacare by counting on what he called the stupidity of the American people. Because if they admitted they were taking money from a bunch of young people who are struggling, and by the way, that's a regressive transfer of wealth. If you look at people's wealth curve over life, they tend to be wealthier when they're older. So you're taking money from less wealthy young people who are struggling and starting their careers, and you're transferring it to older, wealthier people. That doesn't make any sense. It's one of the reasons young people have shifted so dramatically on Obamacare. But let me answer the other half of your question, which is what should we be doing affirmatively? Because to say we should repeal Obamacare doesn't mean that we're done when we do that. We need health care reform. I think health care reform should start from principles that expand competition in the marketplace, that empower consumers and patients, and that disempower government from getting between you and your doctor. Now, what does that mean in specifics? I think three reforms are critical. Number one, we ought to allow people to purchase health insurance across state lines. That's currently illegal. If you live in a particular state, you can't purchase state insurance in the other 49 states. What that would do is immediately create a national 50-state marketplace for insurance, which would make available low-cost, catastrophic care. If you want more coverage, I suspect all of us want to see more people with health insurance coverage. What do you want? You want more choices and lower costs. What does Obamacare do? It has fewer choices and higher costs. The biggest barrier to access is cost. And allowing people to purchase across state lines would enable young, healthy people to buy, for example, catastrophic policies that are lower cost. Number two, we ought to expand health savings accounts so that people can save in a tax-advantaged way for more routine health needs. And then number three, we ought to work to de-link health insurance from employment. You know, a lot of folks don't know the historical origins of that. It's actually a historical accident that most of us get our health insurance from our place of employment. It arose coming out of World War II, where wage and price controls were in effect. And employers were not allowed to attract new employees by offering higher wages. So instead they began offering perks, and the tax laws favored offering health insurance. Problem is, we don't live in the 1950s anymore. We don't live in the sort of society where people go work for one company for 40 years, retire, and get a gold watch. We live in a mobile, transitory society. Most of the folks in this room will work for multiple companies or on your own in multiple industries, potentially in multiple states. And the problem is, look, if you or I lose our jobs, you don't lose your life insurance, you don't lose your house insurance, you don't lose your car insurance. There's no reason on earth you should lose your health insurance. And it's the worst possible one to lose because much of the problem of pre-existing conditions comes from someone who has health insurance, loses it because they lose a job or transfer from a job, and then they can't get a new policy. And we ought to reform it so health insurance policies, they're personal, they're portable, and they're affordable. I think that's the sort of positive health reform that we ought to be working together, ideally in a bipartisan way to get done.
We have a question over here, Senator.
Right here.
Oh, thanks.
I'm from Texas too.
Excellent. From where?
Dallas.
Very good.
Yeehaw. My question is, what do you say to the people that think that government is broken and it's outdated? You talk about the addendum strategy, and you talked about, pointing the fingers at Reid and the White House, and I'm thinking that how can we point the fingers back at ourselves as members of the Senate and the House? Because I think that it's like you're still using Zach Morris phones when we all have iPhones. That makes sense. And so, how are you going to upgrade the rules of the way that you're interacting with each other?
I think that is a fabulous question, a very insightful question. And let me say, number one, listen, I agree with the premise. The Senate is broken and it's broken badly. And one of the things I've said many, many times is that the biggest political divide we have in this country is not between Republicans and Democrats. The biggest political divide in this country is between career politicians in Washington, in both parties, and the American people. Most common thing you hear as you travel the country is people who are saying, my elected officials, they go to Washington and they stop listening to me. You hear this from Republicans, Democrats, Independents, Libertarians, something in the water here, where they just aren't listening to the people we're supposed to work for. I mentioned my top priority is jobs and economic growth. The reason's simple. That's the top priority of Texans. I've got a job to represent 26 million Texans. Doesn't matter what part of Texas you're in, that's the top priority of Texans. The 2 years I've been here, the Senate has spent zero time even talking about jobs and economic growth, even talking about tax reform or regulatory reform and getting small businesses back, hiring and creating jobs and opportunity. So how do you change it? The answer to that, how many of y'all are involved in tech in some way? Wow. Okay, this is a very heavy tech crowd. Good. Look, one of the things tech does fantastically, and I grew up in the tech world. My parents were both mathematicians and computer programmers who were small business owners. They started a seismic data processing company, and I grew up working for them in the tech world. One of the things that tech does a lot is produces disruptive apps. Disrupts the means of delivery of a good or service. And what y'all have seen is whenever that happens, whoever the incumbent providers are, there's enormous pushback. Listen, how many people here use Uber? I use Uber constantly. I don't have a car in Washington because of Uber. It's fantastic. And yet everywhere Uber goes, the existing taxi commissions fight furiously at that new competition, new entrant, because it's a new means of delivering a service that is better than the existing one. What I'm trying to do in the political world is frankly the same thing, which is shift the means of decision-making away from Washington. This town is corrupt. There's a corrupt alliance of lobbyists, special interests, major corporations that get in bed with Democrats and Republicans. And if you notice, the rich get richer, and everyone else gets screwed. And what I've been trying to do in the 2 years I've been here is as much as possible shift the power back to the American people, empower the American people. The only way to change Washington is for the American people to rise up and hold elected officials accountable, stop listening to the entrenched interests, start listening to the American people. And one of the reasons that you have seen so many slings and arrows tossed my direction is those who like decision-making in smoke-filled rooms in Washington, just like the taxi commissions, are very unhappy at something that would energize millions of Americans. I tell you, in the middle of the battle we were having earlier this year, one of my colleagues literally made a fist, pounded the table, and said, "My constituents keep calling me." I was genuinely speechless. I was like, I thought that's what we were supposed to be doing. Look, the only way to change it is to shift the power back to the American people. And I'll make a final point. There was an amusing column several weeks ago in the New York Times, David Brooks wrote. David Brooks is not a fan of mine. And Brooks had a column where he said, only two people, Ted Cruz and Karl Marx, believe you can give power to the masses. I have to admit, I laughed out loud. I've never been linked together with Karl Marx. That was a little surreal. But what then followed was this ode to rule by the elites in Washington. Stop empowering the masses. Let our smarter philosopher kings in Washington govern and get out of the way. And I have to admit, I read that article and thought, you know what, I wish I could print this article, Xerox it, and mail it to 330 million Americans. Say, I plead guilty. You're right. You know what? The elites in Washington have screwed it up. We've got $18 trillion in debt, more than our national GDP. And what we're doing isn't working. So your question, how do you change a broken system? The most important piece, and what I would urge each of y'all to do, the key to changing the system are the men and women in this room. Are each of y'all standing up and speaking out?
We have a question back here, sir.
Well, unfortunately, we've got 1 minute left to a vote, so I've got to sprint to the floor of the Senate. But I just want to thank you all for your leadership. I am inspired that you're standing up, fighting and leading in any way I can help. I'm eager to stand with you and work together. So thank you. God bless.